navigation like in the browser is usually pretty straightforward. You have a URL, and you go to another URL, and then you have the page, right? And usually, like if you're not building a single page app, like it's even easier. You just go to a URL and you have the thing, and you don't have to keep the state of the other page in memory. You don't have to worry about updating the content of the other screens while you're over in another screen. So for example, if you're on a home feed, like on Facebook, and then you go over to profile, and then you press like on someone's post, and then you go back to the home feed, you need to see that you've liked that post and the proper counts reflected and that kind of thing. And so these are just things that arise from single-page apps in general, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with already. But in addition to this, so this is just the added complexity of that, but in addition to that, you have all sorts of different ways of navigating within the mobile context, right? You have like a tab navigation. Within each tab, you might have separate stacks of screens. By stack, I mean same as like the history stack in the browser. So maybe you tap on something, it pushes a new screen on, you go to another tab, you maintain the tab stack in the original tab that you were on, but now you start pushing to another stack. Maybe you push a modal up, the modal has its own stack as well. And so the kind of like primary currency of navigation on mobile is like the browser in that the history is sort of an ongoing set of URLs, although not necessarily represented as URLs on mobile. On mobile, you have like multiple of those stacks going on at the same time. And there needs to be kind of like a meta stack that tracks which stack is active so that when you go back between them using like the Android back button, you're able to jump to the right place. So there's a lot of complexity there, but thankfully, you don't really have to think too much about it, because if you did, then you would never be able to make a mobile app because it would take forever. So there are libraries that do most of this for you. And the one that we're going to look at here is called React Navigation. There are a lot of navigation libraries for React Native. There are very few good ones. I don't know if there are any great ones. React Navigation is I guess the most recent culmination of efforts from a few people at Facebook who wrote the original one when React Native was first released, which had all sorts of problems, and then iterated on that and improved it again. And that was then used as the basis for a bunch of third-party components, and there was this huge proliferation. It was kind of like with Flux. When Flux was released, then suddenly there were 100 different implementations of Flux, and there was finally Redux in the end. We're hoping that React Navigation ends up being like the Redux for navigation. No offense, MobX in the other room. There are alternatives also, I guess, but if you know what I mean. Like, MobX isn't Flux, so it still applies. Anyways, that just distorted the point. But yeah, so we're going to look at React Navigation, and what we're going to do is described in this mock-up, right? So we have, first we're going to start with taking this screen that we have and pushing another screen on that has, it's just shown here as blank, but it'll have the content with more information on like what's happening. So if I tap on the like conference keynote thing, then we'll see conference keynote, the time, we'll see the description, right? The detail screen that we did before, and be able to like swipe back and press a back button to go back and that sort of thing. Lots of people drink water when they're on stage, but I drink coffee. So React Navigation, let's go to reactnavigation.org. Here's an interesting bit of trivia. Reactnavigation.org is actually implemented using React Navigation. So it is not necessarily only for development for mobile. Right, this entire thing you can see in the repo uses it as well. And that was part of the idea, and Eric Vicente is going to talk about it more He did last year. He's back again to talk about it more again this year. And you can get more information on that side of things. We'll focus on specifically the mobile aspect of it. So let's look at this like really simple example here. In fact, sure. Let's just copy this in to a Snack. I think we have React Navigation on Snack. I hope so. Oh, my bad. It should be. Okay, the Android's loading really slow there, so let's just jump into this one. And while that's loading, let's take a look at what's happening here. So from React Navigation, we're importing something called Stack Navigator. So Stack Navigator is it's a function, actually, despite the casing of it maybe making it look like something else. And it does something fairly important, which is it defines what are the possible screens that can exist inside of a given stack, right? So this might be, we might just have one stack for our app. This would be like on a website where you can click on a link and then you go to another page, and then you click on a link and you go to another page. You can define that all within, like, it's all happening in the same stack. If you have two tabs, you would have potentially a different stack for each tab. So here, all we're doing is saying we have this home screen component. That is the only screen that exists. It's the only route that's defined within this Stack Navigator, and therefore it's the default selected one when we render it. And then what we do is specify a title in navigation options, so you can see welcome, and render out some content there. This is definitely super confusing to everybody here right now. If you've never looked at navigation in React Native, and that's totally fine. Let's take it kind of slowly with this. Let's add another screen. All right, so we have this other screen. We can then say, we're going to name this route maybe Brent. We'll call it Brent for fun. Okay. And that really doesn't do too much for us here. Let's do on press. And format that. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. So on the web, you usually have like an anchor tag, right? You want to go somewhere, you click on an anchor, it tells you what URL to go to, and that's that. Or maybe you have, if you're using React Router, like a link component. You can build something like that on top of what exists with React Navigation, but the API that comes out of the box is passed in through a prop called navigation. So let's see an example. So this is usually the pattern that is used when you want to access it. There are a bunch of properties that exist on this navigation object, but right now we're just going to look at navigate. So we could say navigate Brent. And if I can click on that, see it brings me to this other screen. Right? So of course, you could just get rid of that and say, and that works equivalently. All right, so what's happening here? We have this home screen. It's the first one in here. It's just by default, unless you specify what route you want to be the initial route, it'll just pick the first one that you add to the Stack Navigator and make that the default. And then it knows we're on iOS, so it's like, okay, we should use this style of navigation. It looks different on Android. And when we press on this button, we tell this navigation prop that's passed into every component that's defined in the Stack Navigator. We tell it to navigate to this route. I think maybe that's kind of clear. I mean, it's a big API surface area, and this is just a little taste of it, but hopefully that kind of makes sense. One thing to note as well is we have this navigation options static property. So we use that in the case of the home screen to set the title to welcome. We could also set the title on the other one to that, right? And then, right now the title on that one is like this. Any questions so far about this basic example? Yep.
The navigate function always pushes the next field to the stack?
Not necessarily. We'll look at some examples of that in a bit, but if there's no way to like reach that route from the current stack, then maybe it'll switch to like the tab that has that name. It's sometimes too clever for its own good, but you can talk to Eric about that and complain. So yeah, there are various behaviors that it can have. In this case, it's pushing. I'm going to save this so you can play with it if you like. Simple navigation. And then we'll look at some other stuff. All right. So one thing you could see here is, in addition to just navigating to another route, you can pass in some parameters. So it wouldn't be too useful to go to another route all the time unless you were able to do that. Usually again, on the web, you use like the path or some query parameters or something like that. Here you can just use a regular object and pass in whatever you like. Let's look at, before diving into some of these configuration options too much, let's look at tab navigators. So tab navigators, I mean, it's kind of what you expect it to be, really. You have two different stacks or three different stacks or n amount of stacks. And what tab navigators do is handle the events that take you from one of those stacks being focused to another one being focused. So when you tap on the bottom of the screen and you go from one tab to another, it just jumps to the other one. The default behavior for Tab Navigator on Android is actually to have a slider and like a bar across the top. Our mockups don't do that, so we'll customize it to work like that. But let's just add a simple Tab Navigator to this thing that we have here, so I can demonstrate it. So the first thing I'm going to do is call this stack like, this will be home stack, and then make another one, call it like about stack. They can just have the same contents for now. And let's just make it not break. Right. So we have a tab navigator. It's actually pretty pleasant in that the API for these navigators is essentially the same thing, because, or at least at the route definition point of it, because ultimately what the navigators do is they're meant to navigate between different routes in your app using various types of navigation behavior. In the context of a stack, you want to push something onto the screen, and you want to be able to swipe it back and that sort of thing. In the case of a tab, you want to just make the other thing appear right away and render whatever UI is appropriate for that. So most of the configuration is quite similar, so we can just do that quickly. And we can say our first tab will be home, and we'll give it. Second tab will be about, and we'll say screen. And that looks pretty good. And let's export default my app. No, don't go away. Okay, so now we have these tabs on the bottom here. Not super useful because we have the same content. So let's just say this one is like this, and this one is like that. Right? So we can jump between the two tabs now. And each of these can have their own stacks inside of them, clearly. So this is like the primary thing that we need to do in order to add navigation to our app. There is, of course, a lot of configuration. I'm not going to cover it all here, but we'll need to, in order to make it work like this, you'll see that there's no navigation bar on here, but there is a navigation bar on this screen. So we need to be able to configure that. And you can see the icons don't look like that. So they actually have icons. So yeah, there are a few things to do there. All right, so let's, I guess, get started with that. Was there anything else I wanted to say about this first? Let's edit the title. And I'll post this in our Slack so you can play with it. Oh, right, I wanted to show you what it looked like on Android as well. Some of you may have already seen that if you played with it, but as you might have noticed, I like to use this tool to test things out because it's really easy to just jump between like iOS and Android and see the updates right away. Sorry, I'm a terrible shill for the place that I work, but it's pretty good. So, all right, so this is on the top of the screen, right? So one thing that I should change here that is worth mentioning, you can see how the status bar is overlaying the content on Android, and it doesn't do that on iOS. So this is kind of like a cultural thing that might not stick around for a while. I don't know, cultural, whatever, ecosystem thing. It might not be around for a while, but by default, React Native projects, when you run React Native init, which is this way to create like an empty plain React Native project through the React Native CLI, which includes the Xcode project and the Android Studio project and all of that. It's configured to have different behavior for the status bar on iOS and Android. So on iOS, you render under the status bar by default, and on Android, you don't. And so if you make an app using that starter as your base, then you have a lot of places where you have to factor in like, oh, am I on iOS? Then do this thing. Am I on Android? then do this other thing. Because the status bar is laid out differently. With Expo and by extension, Create React Native App, what we chose to do was make it behave the same on both platforms. So if you want something to render under the status bar, then you just do nothing and it does that. If you want to add some space above it or whatever, then you can do that. And so React Navigation was built on top of a React Native init project, and it didn't factor this in. And it's something that it will factor in at some point, and probably will make an upstream change at some point. I mean, we'll see what happens, but I'm heavily in favor of just making it behave exactly the same on the two platforms, so you don't have to have that overhead on each project. So that's a long-winded answer. But if we want to fix that, we can do the following. So we create some app component, we return my app. So what this actually returns is a React component. Tab Navigator, this is a valid React component. And get rid of that. And now I just want to import from here, platform and view. I'll wrap this in a view. And I've got to set it to flex1. And I can do now platform.os is Android. Do I have Expo imported? I do not. Something like that. You can set whatever color you want. And that seems wrong. Accidentally disabled preview. Sorry about that. 48. Oh, I'm 7th in queue to open this up. No, 6th. Moving up. Anyways, that fixes it. We'll jump back there in a minute. So yeah, all I did there, right, was made a wrapper around the entire app, like this root navigation component, and added a view to the top that has a height equivalent to the status bar height. And so then that just pushes all the content down so that it looks as it should. So. Sure. Any questions? I don't know why it's giving me this error. What you doing? Right, I just added something to the top. So I have that kind of thing. Right, maybe you want to get rid of the header in this context, but yeah, that's how this works. You can also, like I said, customize it. You can move the emulator. You move the tab bar to the bottom if you want, which is what we're going to do now. So now works properly. You don't have to do that on iOS because React Navigation assumes on iOS that it's rendering under the status bar, whereas on Android, React Navigation assumes that you're not rendering under the status bar. It assumes that you have the status bar is like 0, 0 of your app, and that assumption doesn't hold within Create React Native App and Expo, and it's something that's just like a little inconsistency in the ecosystem right now that should be leveled out, but yeah. All right. Oh, we have so much time. This is perfect. So the first thing we should do then is just make it so we can push a new screen. So let's go into this. First of all, do we have React Navigation installed? We do not, so I will use Yarn. You can use NPM or whatever you like. You use what? Yeah, I don't know, maybe. All right, so I've got that in here. That's probably not too exciting. And let's make it work. So import Stack Navigator from React Navigation. Cool, we have Stack Navigator. So not doing anything, but we know that our schedule stack has 2 possible routes, right? What are the two routes in our schedule stack?
Schedule and then everything else.
Yeah, sure. So let's call it schedule, or the schedule list just to disambiguate, but same thing, which is called, which is uses the schedule screen. And then we can say event details, sure. Screen, event details. And now here, let's render schedule stack. Cool, so that looks like garbage because we have this big navigation bar on the top, and as I pointed out here, we don't want that. So we can configure this in here actually. The second parameter passed into Stack Navigator is a list of configuration options. Let us peruse those options. So, as I mentioned before, the first route that's listed in the list of routes will, by default, just be the one that is first selected and first shows up in the stack. If for some reason you want to change that, maybe you're like testing something, or maybe you just want to sort things alphabetically or whatever, just specify the initial route name, which is, this is the route name. So you could say like initial route name should event details, and then it'll use that one instead. We're not doing that though. So these are kind of like, I won't go into path here, but yeah, let's not look at that yet. Okay, so visual options. We want to change the header itself. So in order to do that, we actually, so there are a lot of options here, right? And some of them are kind of confusingly named. As you know, naming is very difficult in software development. So bear with me with these names. We'll hopefully get there, but I wouldn't expect you to walk out of here and know these, or even in a week, if you use it every day, to know all the options very well. Just look at the documentation. The most common ones you'll get down really quickly because they're quite easy, but you know, you're going to be looking here a lot. So the header is actually something you can customize on a screen-by-screen basis. So what I mean by that is on the schedule screen, right, we could say here, using that static navigation options that I mentioned, header, we could just make it like a view, but if we don't want to render anything, we just say null. Right, okay, so it's gone. So looks a lot better. But now we need to have some way to actually go to the details for these. So we can look at our render item, and let's see, have we imported this? What component do you think we should use to make it so we can navigate to that screen? So we can like press on it and then go somewhere. I heard someone whisper touchable. That's how quiet it is in here. Someone was like, touchable. And I was like, I got you, way back there. And he's laughing now. So, feel free to talk, it's fine. I have a microphone. If you get too loud, I'll just talk over you, so it doesn't matter. I'm just going to make it touchable opacity because that's the first one that came to mind. But there are other options. Touchable opacity doesn't have an Android ripple effect, which I'm sure you want if you're using Android. So you probably don't want to use touchable opacity in that case. You want to use touchable native feedback, or use a library that abstracts over those and uses touchable native feedback on Android and uses some other alternative that one that I made, or I don't remember their GitHub organization name. App and Flow. Nice. This one's pretty new, called React Native Touchable, but it's a very simple thing. So touchable feedback equals opacity, feedback none, and whatever. And on Android, it will just, if you choose native, do that. So you can say like, behavior, if platform is this, then do native, otherwise do the other thing, which is easier than like swapping out entire components. I'll post this link here so you can read it, because I just like mumbled it and it probably doesn't make much sense, but the README is there and it's pretty clear. And it has a link to play with it on Expo, so that's pretty sweet. Touchable opacity, do this stuff. And then we need some kind of on press for it, right? I like to just pull these out into functions. So we could say handle press row. Actually, in this case, it's not super useful because we don't have the item itself that we're pressing. I prefer to not use the bind thing and instead do this. But Devin and I are different people. We have a right to have different preferences. So, God. So when you press on it, we do this props.navigation.navigate, which is a lot of words with nav and whatever, but that's what it is. And so we say, want to navigate to the event details screen. So event details, then we're going to pass something in, but I'm pretty sure right now the event details screen doesn't have dynamic content, so that's fine. So we just don't really do anything with it. So you can see as I press on that, it's like highlighting it a little bit. Is it going to work? I don't know, probably. Okay, there you go. But that also looks, again, super ugly, right? Because it's like, look at it jump down there. I'm sure you've used apps where this happens, where you like go from one screen to another, and then the navigation bar shifts the layout a little bit, and just doesn't quite, like, just watch it for a second. Right, it appears on the list screen. And so it does this because in order to do like the animations that you get on iOS, you share a navigation bar and then just animate things within it. And so you need to have that thing on the screen. Another way that you'll see this behavior sometimes is you'll be like swiping back and the navigation bar will like stay on the screen. And then when you get to the other screen where there's no navigation bar, it'll suddenly just disappear. But that's not really desirable. And there's this really useful option for that, which we could see here, header mode. So float, we could see here, renders a single header that stays on top and animates as screens are changed. That is the default behavior on iOS. Android, you might realize if you use an Android phone that when you go to a new screen, it seems like, oh, it's a brand new navigation header. It's good, yeah, whatever. So that's basically what we want in this case. We want the behavior of just having a navigation header that is specific to that screen. There are no other screens in this stack. It's just we have the talks and we have the details. So this will work for that case. So we want to use header mode. So header mode screen. And this is passed in to here. Oops. Because this is an option that exists for the for the entire stack. You can't say header mode float for one screen in a stack and then header mode screen for another screen in the stack, because that doesn't make sense. How do you go between one and the other when they have completely different conceptions of how headers should behave? So we do header mode screen, and then if we refresh this, right, it transitions nicely over top, and it just sort of goes away, and you can do that kind of thing, and whatever. Cool, so that's like getting us there. It's a lot closer than we were a few minutes ago. So let's take another quick moment to see if anyone has any questions about this stuff. Are you scratching your nose, or are you asking a question? Yeah.
Can we summarize what reasons we are using like additional options for headers? I don't really get the idea what's the problem. Like there is like jumping, like we can specify that there
Sure.
no headers.
Yeah. So I'll get rid of this again. So there's like one container for this entire stack, right? There's a container, it has cards that are stacked on top of each other, cards in a sense of a screen with like a shadow on it, and they move side to side as you push screens in and swipe screens out. And then at the top of that, you have a navigation header. And so when you're swiping back from one screen to another, you have in the float style, you have one navigation bar that is just positioned above everything. It's on the top of everything. You swipe back, and then these different elements inside of that navigation bar will animate to do different things, like animate the title into the middle, or fade out the button, fade in another button, and that kind of thing. And so if one screen doesn't have a header and another screen does, and you're using that float navigation, right? When I'm swiping back here, like what behavior would you expect to happen to make it not like that? Where this one has a header, right? And this one doesn't have a header, this other one. So would you, when you start swiping, immediately get rid of the nav bar? That's one option. It still feels kind of weird, right? Like you would start swiping and then your whole screen would just like jump up and the nav bar would go away. Or you're swiping back and you have the nav bar visible until the screen's gone, and then the content jumps up because the nav bar's gone, because this screen doesn't have one.
Is this native behavior or as I understood, native transforms our navigation, components to native iOS navigation, right?
In this case, it's not using native iOS navigation. But this, I mean, it's a similar general rule that applies, regardless of, like this goes beyond even just this is just like how the physical world works, right? If you have a thing that doesn't have a thing, and then you have another thing that has the thing, and you want to transition to the other thing, there has to be a point at which the thing disappears, right? And so, so your option is either you get rid of it right away, or you wait until the end, and then you have to do a jumpiness thing like this, or you tell it, okay, just attach the nav bar to this screen so that as I swipe away, it just stays on that screen, right? It's attached to this particular screen, which is what happens when I say header mode screen, right? Now as I swipe away, it's like, okay, it's attached to that.
And initially we disabled like header on this component.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that it will never be has header. For example, if we're gonna just go to this page from, for example, from other tab,
Mhm.
so is there should be like backwards motions?
Well, you would never get to this screen from anywhere else, right? So if you would, then that would be something to consider for sure.
Default state is there is always header.
Yeah, the default is to have a header, yeah. So the question was, if you could get to this screen from somewhere else, then like how would you go back? There'd be no back button. And so that's just like a design consideration, right? We know that you can't get to the screen from anywhere else. It's just what happens when you go to what is soon to be a tab navigation on the bottom. And so we don't really worry about that. Whereas this one, we're here, we want to have a back button, so we show the header there. Any questions? Yep. Yeah, can you speak just a bit more loud? Okay. Sure. Screen props. I'm not familiar with that option. But I see, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's, what's the question about it, sorry? Yeah. Okay. Right. So how do you reconcile whether like one takes priority over the other, or? That's a good question. I think, well, best practices, don't get me started on that word, but I really just like that word. But so screen props is just, as it says here, I wasn't familiar with this option until you just mentioned it, but it looks like it's passed down on this.props.screenProps. Whereas when you pass params, it's like this.props.navigation.state.params. And so they're completely different things. So screen props kind of seems like something that is like an alternative to context. It just makes it easier to pass some data down from the root and make it available to all their screens. But yeah, I'm not super familiar with that option. You could probably ask Eric Vicente when he's around sometime. Sorry, don't but it looks like it goes to every child. Any other questions? Hopefully one I can answer. No. Yeah. All right. I'm going to commit this, and do you want to take, how long do we have? Oh, we have time. Want to take a short break, and then we can look at adding tab navigation to this, and then we'll customize everything so that it looks good. Good? All right.